Hey guys, Sandra's Sawdust Girl here. Today I'm going to show you how I did the decorative door trim around this here door, right here. For starters, I had to make the side of the cabinet look like it was part of the wall. And this would have been easier to do had I had my truck to pick up a sheet of beadboard, but my truck was in the shop, so I used a bunch of scraps that I had on hand, which required a lot of putty and sanding. Next, I installed the vertical casings, which are just primed pine. I used a block of wood to make sure that the casing was flush with the inside of the doorway. Now you'll notice there's no beadboard underneath this horizontal piece. That's important because this piece needs to be shallow to the verticals. If I was installing the whole thing on a flat wall, the horizontal piece I would use a thinner piece of material, say a 1/4 inch MDF or 1/2 inch instead of 3/4 inch, which is what all of this casing is. These little bump outs are what make the crown molding and the small trim moldings look really cool. This requires some tricky little cuts, but it's worth it. I used a piece of 1x2 prime pine to cover the gap between that horizontal casing and the beadboard on the ceiling in the entryway. And then it's time to start with the decorative little trim moldings. Rather than measure with a tape measure teeny tiny return pieces, I like to just cut the first angle. This is an inside corner, and then mark the location for the next, which is going to be an outside corner. And I did both ends, so I could cut them both at once. Making sure my hands are well out of the path of the blade, even if it doesn't look like it. This is how I make my return cuts. Both ends of the return piece are cut at the same angle, so my saw is already set up at the right angle. Now, I don't want to cut all the way through this piece or I'll have to start over and remeasure. So I make my mark and then I just cut long and make a little nick and check the saw mark in reference to my pencil mark and then creep in on my mark. And then after the cut, there's usually this little nib that's left over. And sometimes you can break it off, but it's better to just grab a utility knife and slice that off. These little return pieces tend to break if you try to nail them, and often the force of the nail shooting in can move them out of place. So a little wood glue and painter's tape holds them in place until the glue dries, and then you're good to go with the next piece. I always want the two sides of my corner to come together perfectly, and rather than mess around with minute changes to the angle of the miter, I just use a little shim here or there. All right, I'm gonna let that one set up. I'm gonna go to the other side. Hey, come along with me. I took a 1x2 and ripped a couple 1/4 inch thick strips and installed that on the side of my casings. It made the casings look a little bit thicker and chunkier and also hid the gap. I used wood glue, painter's tape, and some nails to hold this in place. At this point, I used my handy little dust collecting sander and sanded everything smooth, filled all of my nail holes, and sanded some more. And then it was time to finish up the crown molding. Now I glue and tape and let dry my return pieces before I start nailing them into place. This MDF molding really soaks up the glue, so I make sure and slather it on there and then smush the two parts together, making sure that every portion of this joint is covered in glue. Then I let it kind of tack up a little bit and then smush the two sides together. And I've got a damp cloth on hand so that I can wipe off the excess squeeze out and then wipe it onto my rag so it's not all over the place. Then I take some long pieces of painter's tape and secure them to the back side of the large piece. Pull it around, closing the seam as tightly as possible, and then pressing the tape to the front of the large piece. You just want to make sure when you're pulling the tape tight that the joint stays perfectly aligned. After I get this first little return piece locked down, I glue and tape the next return onto the same piece and set this aside and let it dry completely before I try to nail it in place. Once it is dry, then I take off the tape and put it in place using a little wood glue on the remaining joints. Again, never afraid to use a little shim here or there when I need to make the joints close up. The walls and ceiling are always a little wonky and wavy anyway, so making the joints perfect is always key. Caulk is a carpenter's best friend. Oh shit, I forgot. What was I thinking? Just an end cut? We all make mistakes. I actually blamed that one on the fact that I was trying to do a little close-up video tutorial for y'all and I was a little distracted by what I was actually doing. I just broke off the offending piece, cut a new one, and moved on. The last few finishing touches are just cutting away the excess shimmage, filling a few nail holes, and painting this sucker out. And here it is all finished and painted. Those little bump outs from the returns give you so much texture and dimension and look really cool and interesting. And there is the rest of the messy kitchen and living room, which will someday be finished as well. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time with something else. Catch you later.